welcome.
We can start.
Sure. I just brought just two little things I thought were helpful. One is it's a little kind of two-sided sheet just about the laws that sort of apply to disability support, broken down into just little digestible chunks to show just kind of where we get some of our ideas from. So there's that.
Take a couple extras back to the faculty if you have some.
Perfect, yeah, I'll put the stack right here. And then this is just, I thought this was important, it's our core services bill and it's our RCW that tells all the schools of what kinds of services we should be providing. So sometimes people are like, well, where did that come from? It's like, well, there actually is stuff out there telling us what we're supposed to be doing. So, all right, well, I'm Angela Merritt. I'm the manager of the Disability Support Services Office here at SFCC. I've been here about 4 years, and prior to that, I worked for the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation for 5 years, and then prior to that, I was at Gonzaga for almost 9 years in their disability office. So each one is so different, you know. So Gonzaga was a much different population than we work with here. So the needs were different. Then DVR was people from all walks of life. And same here. So it's been an interesting journey of working with people from different backgrounds. I guess we all kind of know each other. Maybe we could go around and introduce ourselves.
Hi, I'm Sharday. I am a librarian here at SFCC, and I help coordinate the brown bag. So thank you all for coming.
Hey, you get to be at all of them.
I do. I see the majority of them.
I'm Marianne Selena. I'm over in Addiction Studies. I am the student navigator for our grant students, but I'm now also working with some students on the ground too. So
that's great.
Yeah, it's been great. It's really
And how long have you been here?
Oh, I'm brand new.
Brand new.
Yeah, I started in the tail end of August. Prior to that, I was advising at GU, and I taught English here. Even before that. So yeah, I'm kind of like full circle now, which is really cool.
Yeah. Debbie Ortiz with Addiction Studies grant manager.
I'm Neil Hallgarth. I am the accessibility specialist, and I've been here about 3.5 weeks. But I also taught here before. I taught English here before.
Oh, lots of English teachers that come. That's cool. Okay, so today I just wanted to address some of the basics about what we do and be able to answer some questions. Because nothing is really black and white, which is, I like black and white, so it's hard for me sometimes. But a lot just depends on what the students' needs are and what their functional limitations are and how do we grant access. So I'll just go through kind of how we make those decisions and why we do what we do, and then hopefully answer some questions if you have them. So I need to get out my power. So access is really a civil right. And it came out of a lot of different history and laws. The first law that really affected access for people with disabilities was Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And I believe that came out in 1974. And it wasn't actually enforced until about 1977. And there was actually a huge civil rights movement from between those times. Because nothing was being enforced. So they were telling the public that it needed to create access for people with disabilities, but it was not putting any teeth into that. So I showed the movie Lives Worth Living. I think it was the first year I was here as a PBS special. It's really amazing about the disability civil rights movement. And I mean, back then, you couldn't ride a plane. People were coming to, the Secretary of Health, I think it was, who had to approve the regs to put the teeth into Section 504 was in California, in Berkeley, I believe. And they did sit-ins there. I mean, there were people in like iron lungs, people who had very high medical needs were brought into these buildings where they couldn't even use the bathrooms, and they stayed there for like 30 days. is really amazing. People, they took their, they saw the civil rights movement in the 60s and it really galvanized them to move forward with this. And when you think about it, without social media or anything, how they did that is really amazing. They also staged sit-ins in Washington, D.C., and they got the regs passed. So Section 504 in the Rehab Act, I don't have it here in front of me. Here we go. But it actually has a lot of the provisions. The ADA is way more broad. Section 504 is actually what tells us, it has a section on post-secondary education. Section 104.4, I think it's like 4.1 through 4.8 or something like that. But it basically says we can't pre-screen students to see if they have a disability before admission, so we can't ask that at admission. It is on our application at this time, but it is optional and it's supposed to be for demographic use only. I don't think with the new application a lot of students are actually checking those boxes, so we're not getting a really good sense of how many students we have on campus who have disabilities who are not going through our office at this time. And then it actually talks about what academic adjustments are, so that's pretty cool. We got some good guidance in there. The ADA came out in 1990, and there's several titles. I think Title I's employment. Title II is public entities or public entities who receive federal funding. And Title III is for private entities. So Gonzaga was under Title III, so it's private. We're under Title II. And that just means really there's different avenues of complaint. If like a student wanted to go on and say we were preventing access, they might go to the Department of Education with us, or the Department of Justice with Gonzaga. So really the main thing about the ADA is that it just says no qualified individual with a disability shall, on the basis of disability, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of the services, programs, or activities of a public entity, or be subjected to discrimination by any public entity. The key words there are qualified individual. At schools like Gonzaga, it's easy to say who's qualified in a lot of respects because they have to meet certain requirements to even get in. Where here, we're an open educational environment, pretty much anybody can come in, but there are times when somebody may not be qualified anymore. Like they're not able to participate in the way that a student could participate, and that might be if somebody gets really ill and they can't attend. Like we might try to do some flexibility with attendance, but if they're missing 5 weeks of the school and they're not able to participate in the way that a student needs to participate, they may not be otherwise qualified anymore. So that's where that gray comes in a lot. We have the core services bill, which I gave you. It's an RCW, and it actually says things like, students' disabilities need to have access to tutoring, peer counseling, all the things that other students get, or flexibility in taking test-taking arrangements, flexibility in timelines for completion of courses. Which sometimes it's a little bit of conflict trying to get it incomplete for a student. I'm still learning the rules here sometimes, and they'll say well, a student can have an incomplete, but they have to have everything done by 4 days after the quarter ends. And so sometimes I'm not sure if that's just an internal rule or if that is some kind of federal requirement for financial aid. And so if it's just an internal policy, the law says that if we need to, we can change that policy as an accommodation for somebody. So sometimes figuring out, okay, what's our own policy just because it makes it easier for us, or what is a rule or requirement for certification or for financial aid that needs to be met and that we can't flex or change. And then we have board policy, and that's in our board. If you ever want to go look at it, it's in the student services section. And it basically kind of mirrors the core services bill. It just puts it into our own policy that we will provide accommodations for students. Any questions about that? No? So I just thought I'd put this guy up real quick. This is Ed Roberts, and he was actually down in Berkeley. And he's kind of called the father of independent living. And he had polio. And he was on an iron lung for many, many years, and I guess he tried to kill himself 10 times because he hated living that way. And there's a lot of movies out there about him and stuff, but he changed his mind at some point and decided that life was worth living. And he decided to go to college at UC Berkeley. And, you know, sometimes I think today, like, oh man, it's so hard to accommodate this person. How are we gonna do this? And I think if they could do it back then, when they didn't have computers and technology, he couldn't write. Somebody had to scribe his exams. Somebody had to figure out how he was gonna read, like hold a book up or whatever. He went to school and they actually started, we wouldn't do this now because it's segregation, but they actually had like a house, a medical ward, that all these, they got more and more students to come who had very significant medical needs, and they lived there and they went to school and they were able to get their degrees. He was actually denied by Division of Voc Rehab, saying he was too disabled to work. He went to school anyway, and then he ended up becoming the director of the whole state of California's Division of Voc Rehab. So that's kind of cool. He's a really cool guy, but it just shows that, you know, this was back in the 60s, and they didn't even have laws telling them that they had to accommodate people. And so it's pretty neat that people were going to school and the schools were finding creative ways to work with them. I'm sure there were no curb cuts. He did have, you know, assistants that went with him to make sure that he had, you know, they were able to help him get his books out or do things he needed to do to get through the day. So let's talk a little bit about how we do things. One of the first things I wanted to just talk about was disclosure. So we collect pretty sensitive medical documentation in our office, and we tell students, you know, that this documentation is kept private. There are times under FERPA, because it's not protected by HIPAA, when it comes into our office, it's considered an educational record. There may be times, and there's an educational need to know, that we might share something with an instructor. And it's kind of based on the need of that student at that time. Like if there's a concern and the teacher really needs to understand what's going on with that student, there might be times when we share, or there's a safety issue or something like that. But in general, we don't disclose. So I haven't had it so much here, but at Gonzaga, I get a lot of questions like, well, what's their disability anyway? And well, I can't disclose that to you, but what's your concerns? And we'll talk about, and sometimes I'll say, well, this student, you know, struggles with this or that. Sometimes you can figure out what it is, you know, by talking about it. But very often, we can't disclose the nature of the disability, especially when it's something really stigmatizing. Like we do actually have quite a few students on campus who have schizophrenia. And, you know, when people hear that, sometimes it kind of creates some fear. So we don't disclose that information, but we can talk to somebody about like their concerns, if there's behavior, or they're not sure how to accommodate this student, or something's not working. But like I said, it's not HIPAA protected, so we do have a little bit of freedom there to disclose. Like I'm on the BIT team, so there might be times when I'm like, you know, here's what's going on with this student. Like this might be one of the reasons they're behaving this way, or something like that. Students are protected from discrimination, but not necessarily complete confidentiality. So, like say a student needs a note taker in their class. What we don't want to happen is for a teacher to say, hey, Johnny needs a note taker because he has a disability. That's probably creating an atmosphere that could be discriminatory. But if the teacher says, you know, there's a student in this class who needs a note taker, and if somebody could volunteer, okay, I'm going to hook you guys up after class. That's okay. There are anonymous ways to do it, and that's fine too. But there are times when a student's need for accommodation is going to out them. So if they need to come to our office to take a test, somebody might notice they're gone from class. I contest that very few people notice, because I went through many years of college and never noticed a single person who was missing from class for tests. And if I did, I probably just thought they were sick or something happened. But you know, we can't make it completely confidential, and some disabilities are visible. You might have to use a special chair in your class or whatever, you know. But we do we do need to try to protect people from discrimination. And then our records, some students worry about coming to us because they're worried that somehow their disability records are going to be combined with their academic records. So that if they go on to another school or an employer or the military or whatever, that's going to be known. And so we let them know that our records are completely separate from their educational records and they don't go anywhere. They're not flagged in the system, although here they are kind of flagged because of our state reporting requirements. We code them. And in CTC Link, we're having a big argument because in our old system, we would put a alphanumeric code and nobody knew what that meant and we keep it really secret. But now it puts the code and then the description. So it'll say like whatever code and then it'll say mental disorder. And we're told by the state board that nobody can see that except for a certain chosen few. But I've gone and asked people, hey, can you just go in and see if you can access this screen? And they can. So I feel very uncomfortable about that because students have a right to some privacy. But in general, I mean, that doesn't go on to like EWU with them. Now, if they went to Tacoma Community College, they can see that, they're disability people, and maybe other people. We don't know, they're not supposed to do that.
Is that the 4-digit code, like I've seen where it says that they were first generation student, or if it was a grant that?
It's different, so it's a different indicator. So we do have like an SDIS, and SDIS is just self-disclosed disability, and that's where they check on their application. There's RDIS, which I think pulls the students we've coded, but then there's under like their health information, there's accommodation data, and only certain people are supposed to be able to see that. But it's an HR module in CTC Link, and so it wasn't really meant for our offices, and they've kind of hijacked it to do that. So it doesn't work real well, but at least we're getting the coding to the state. But I was like really shocked when I came here because I'm not used to, at Gonzaga, we kept that we're like, no, we don't share this information with anyone. We might say like, this is our, breakdown of, how many students we have in this category or that, but this actually gets reported up to the state, which used to be completely tied to our disability funding, but it's not tied as closely anymore, but it could in the future, so we code them because we want to be able to do our jobs and have money to do that. So just, if students are like, I don't want to go there because then they're going to know about me, just assure them that any disability records they provide stay within our office. They're separate from their academic records. We do, we do disclose disability to faculty if the student gives us written permission to do so. We have a disclosure form. Like you may have gotten a letter that says like, this student's giving me permission to let you know that they have autism spectrum disorder, and this is how it affects them in the classroom. Because they may want you to know why they don't make eye contact or why they're having such a difficult time presenting, things like that. Will somebody make sure I don't, I'll watch my time.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. This is our population from 2016-17, so for the whole course of the year. You can see that psychological autism and learning disabilities and ADHD were our biggest groups of students. So these are all invisible disabilities. So most people wouldn't know that these students have anything going on that's affecting their ability to perform in school. Speech and language is our lowest one. And then deaf, hard of hearing, that is, I'm not sure if that number reflects, we also serve students over the PACE program since it's on our campus. It's just easier to put interpreters there than make interpreters come from SCC to do it. But I think this is just the students who are SFCC students. And so Cheryl Burkett's the one who runs all the interpreting for that. And we do have 10 part-time hourly interpreters that we employ. Do you have any questions about the numbers? So students have to qualify for our services, and it's not just presenting like a diagnosis. So I have I have a skin condition. Well, yeah, okay, it's a diagnosis, but does it really impact my ability to perform in school? Probably not. So what we do is we have them fill out a little inquiry form. We started doing that about 6 months ago because we were finding a lot of our students coming out of high school don't even know the name of their disability because I think there's been an effort to protect them from stigma and labels. So they're just kind of told like, oh, you're in special ed or whatever, but that's okay. We're not going to tell you that you have a learning disability or whatever it might be. And so they would come in and just say, well, I don't know what my disability is, my mom knows. And we don't feel like that's helpful. The student is supposed to be advocating for themselves in college. And so we give them the inquiry form, we tell them to take it home and think about it. Their mom's probably gonna fill it out for them and bring it back in, also with any documentation they might have. Back in the day when I worked at Gonzaga, we were much stricter about documentation. And part of it is that students in that arena have the financial means to get good documentation. So as you can see, the majority of our students have learning disabilities or ADHD. And so we would pretty much require a learning disability evaluation, which can cost anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000. Some guidance came out from some of our national partners probably in about 2012 when I think it was around Hurricane Katrina actually. When was that? I don't even know. But what happened in Katrina was tons of people, like the schools lost everything. So all their paperwork and documentation, and then a lot of students moved away and started going to school somewhere else. So the schools didn't have any documentation to go off of. And so ahead, our national association put out guidance saying, you need to loosen up your guidelines and take the student's narrative and their history of use of accommodations and be more flexible with that documentation requirement, because when we have natural disasters like this, you can't just be like, oh, sorry, I know you got accommodations at your last school, and you've had a learning disability since you were 5 when you were diagnosed, but we're not going to provide you with services. So things changed a lot while I was out of higher ed, and I came back in with this totally different landscape. So what we do is we say, bring whatever you can, and there are probably about 3 or 4 students I'm working with right now that don't have documentation. But they're 40 years old, they were diagnosed with a learning disability when they were a child, they were in special classes throughout school, but the schools only keep those records for about 7 years and then they shred them. So they have a history of using accommodations, they can talk about what they need, and we're not going to deny them access because they just can't get their hands on those documents and they can't afford to go get a $2,000 evaluation. So we get what we can. It's often IEPs or 504s from the school system, from K through 12. Might be something from their doctors. It might be a really good learning disability eval. And we assess their functional limitations. So we look at, okay, so, you have a reading disorder, so tell me what reading's like for you. We'll describe what reading's like. And so one student may say, well, I start reading and I get to the end of the sentence and I don't remember what I was reading at the beginning of the sentence, and so I have to read it over again like 5 times. And that could be because of a processing speed issue. So it could be, which usually happens in that situation, is they're reading so slowly that their brain, like they just lose what they were reading at the beginning of the sentence because they don't have that fluency. So we might do audio for that because it's a lot faster than how their eyes would process it. They might say the words actually move around on the page, and when I'm like reading, they're actually moving. I go try to go to the next line and I can't find it. And so we might do like something different for them. They might listen, or we might use a colored overlay, which sometimes helps calm that down. Or we might tell them to take a piece of paper and move it down. So every why they have the problem, because in high school they'll just say on an IEP or 504, oh, they just have difficulty reading. But we don't know what that means, so we have to talk to them. And then we look at what academic adjustments will be needed to ensure that we're not evaluating based on their handicap, but on their knowledge. So what I tell students is like, I don't want to test your anxiety level. We want to test what you know. So if taking a test in 50 minutes, you're just going to freak out and not be able to answer anything, that's not showing what you know. So we want to give you that extra time so that you can calm down and demonstrate your knowledge. Same thing with somebody who can't write. We're not going to say, well, sorry, I guess you just can't take your test. We'll scribe the test or dictate. And we have a couple students right now, like one guy, his arms, he was born with arms that maybe go about down to here and he can't use his hands. So he comes in to take his tests and we scribe those for him. And we're very careful. We tell him we're only going to write down exactly what you say, and we don't give hints or anything like that. Some students in high school, their teachers would rephrase questions and things like that, and they want us to do that. We let them know. But that would be a modification that we can't make. Okay, so types of accommodations. Classroom modifications, so that might be things like extended time for exams, and I don't remember what my little link here is. That's from Section 504 of the Rehab Act. It's one of the kind of main things in there. Extended time is used for many, many different types of disabilities and functional limitations, just because there are so many reasons why a disability might slow somebody down. And extended time is an easy thing to do that's not fundamentally altering the exam in any way. We might have seating accommodations, so we might have a special chair if they have a really bad back, which in addiction studies there's several. We might need them to sit at the front because they can't see very well or they can't hear very well and they need to really focus. They might have PTSD and they can't concentrate when somebody's sitting behind them, so they might sit like back by the door where they feel safest or something like that. So kind of talk about, okay, how can we make it so that you feel like you can access the class? Assistive technology, so they might be ability to type in-class assignments. We have a lot of students on this campus with autism who have very poor handwriting. It's kind of part of the disorder. When I first started here, there was a student in a class and I'd sent a letter to their teacher about their handwriting, which he may not have read, but the teacher went up to him in the middle of class and said, "What is wrong with you? I can't even read that." And he was, yeah, and like the kid, left, and him and his dad came in. His dad was really angry, which I don't blame him. And we had to withdraw him from the class and give him his money back. But the teacher probably didn't even think, like when you call somebody out like that, you really don't know. He probably forgot, that the student had a disability. But sometimes it shamed him and embarrassed him in front of his peers. He's always written like that. He's never going to be able to write any differently. So a lot of times we'll say, the student is going to bring a laptop to class for their notes. Maybe they'll record the lecture. Any in-class writing, they may need to type it so that you can read it and they can read it. Because really, we're not evaluating somebody on the neatness of their penmanship. We're writing them on their, we're evaluating them on their ideas, and we need to give them the opportunity to express those. Policy modifications are the hardest to figure out and negotiate, and specifically flexibility in attendance. There are a few schools who just aren't doing it at all. There are some schools who have had also civil rights come in and dictate how they're going to do their process because they got in trouble for maybe not doing it in a way that was appropriate. One of the things we're not supposed to do, and that these schools got in trouble for, is make the student negotiate the terms of their flexibility in attendance. And the reason for that is because there's a power differential between a teacher and a student. And the teacher may just say, "No, I'm not giving you any flexibility," and the student is like, "Okay," and that's the conversation. So what some schools were doing is sending out a little form and saying, the student and the faculty need to go through this form to determine how many extra absences are appropriate in this class. So they might say well, how much is class participation required in this class? And the teacher would write some stuff down. And they'd kind of have a list of questions they would go through, and the student and the faculty were supposed to negotiate that together. Not supposed to do that. So ours isn't that great. Basically what we say is we give the teacher a little thing that says, we can't determine a numerical value of what flexibility looks like in your class, So we're asking for a couple days flexibility. And the student is supposed to contact you if they are ill and they cannot make it to class and talk to you about how to make that up. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I think there are teachers on the campus who are just like, no, I've got my policy and I'm gonna stick to it. And we haven't had very many problems, thank goodness. And then there are other teachers who might go above and beyond and go too far with the flexibility. But basically what we're asking for is if this student is doing well in your class and they have a chronic illness, so it's usually somebody who has like cancer or any kind of chronic illness that they can't predict when they're going to get sick. We're not going to make them go to the doctor every time they have an episode, like a seizure or whatever, because that's unrealistic, that's not appropriate, it's making the student jump through hoops. But we know there are going to be periodic times when they get ill. So we're asking people not to adhere to that, like 3 days and you're done, which most people hear are pretty good. They're like 10. And I'm like, to the student, I tell them, we have 11 weeks. Missing 10 days is like 2 weeks out of 11. That's extremely generous. So there may be a class where the teacher's like, no, because of the format of my class, we cannot flex attendance, and this is why. But we have to have that interactive process. So we can't just categorically say no. Like we might actually, the best thing to do in a case like that would be to then involve like the dean and make a decision together and put it in writing so that we don't get in trouble.
So if you're making that decision together, but you can't have that conversation with the student, then it's like contacting you as a facilitator for that
Yeah, we
conversation?
always say if you have any problems, like if you don't think this is gonna work in your class or the student's approaching too many absences, give us a call. We don't get those calls very often, and I'm just hoping and praying that's because things are working. But like this spring, we had a student who was hospitalized for mental health about 2 weeks before finals. Or I think it was about a week before finals, because it was the week before and then finals. She had a 98% in her class. So, to the teacher, I basically say, can we just give the student the grade they've earned up to this point? Can we give them an incomplete so that they can do their final later? Like, it's pretty much unjust to say, sorry, then you're just gonna fail the class. 98% at this point. The teacher opted to give an incomplete. The student actually underwent like really terrible traumatic, she did electroshock therapy for like 6 weeks and it actually like destroyed her memory. She's not back at school yet, but she did the work, like she went through the summer, did the work, and then came back to find that the teacher had taken 50% off of every assignment that she had turned in late. And it's so hard for me to go to an instructor and say, I don't think this is right. But I did go to him and I just said, you agreed to an incomplete and it was not part of the agreement that you were going to take 50% off of every assignment. And I just don't think that's equitable. And so he regraded those and she got like a 90% or whatever. So sometimes it's a negotiation back and forth. And I think some teachers really want to stick to their rules because I think if they bend it for one person, they're gonna have to bend it for everyone. But I just try to assure them that this is an accommodation situation. And there are times when I'm wrong too. So that's why it has to be a back and forth because I may have one view and not understand the dynamics of the class. And the law says it must be an interactive process. So we have to go back and say, okay, well, will this work or will that work instead of just giving a categorical no.
Okay, and we're at 12:15.
Okay, and we have till 12:40. Okay. So the accommodation process. The student has to self-identify to get services. Sometimes people will say, hey, here's a student I'm struggling with, and that's okay. I usually just say, well, refer them to us if you can. But the best thing to do is to say, here's all your options on campus, and you can go to counseling, tutoring, the disability office, so that the student doesn't feel like, oh, you're telling me that I have a disability, you want me to go there. We cannot make them come to our office. So you can suggest, but they don't have to come. So if they do initiate services with our office, they must request their accommodations quarterly. And we do that in person, by phone, or email. And I send out reminders to students, and if there's a drastic change or something, or say they have like a condition like cancer and they're getting chemo, well, they may be done with chemo, they may not need us anymore. So sometimes they'll come in to talk about their health and what's changed. Once they've requested the accommodations, we wait till usually right before the quarter starts and send those letters to faculty via SharePoint right now. Students can request their accommodations at any time in the quarter. So we're still sending out letters now, but we let them know that accommodations are non-retroactive. So if you bombed 3 tests, we put your testing accommodations in place from now moving forward, and you can't retake those, we can't tell the teacher to disregard those, but that we just move forward from this point. We encourage a student to speak with faculty privately. My view is that students are responsible for their accommodations, so I don't think teachers need to go up to a student and say, hey, I got that letter, do you need whatever? Some students expect the teacher to do that, and then I remind the student that it's your responsibility to talk to your teacher and let them know if you need your accommodations, because based on the nature of their class, you may not need them. So if you have testing accommodations, but you're in an English class that's all writing based, you probably don't need those testing accommodations. So you need to let your teacher know if you need to use those accommodations. Like I said, they may or may not use them. And then if there's any problems, we tell the student to contact us immediately and the faculty member and let us know. With our SharePoint letters, the teacher can now submit a response back to us. So it's kind of cool. So the first couple of weeks especially, I'm checking our mailbox every day, and if a teacher is concerned about something or whatever it may be, I will email them back or call them, and we'll try to work out what we can. Any questions about that? So really, a big part of our job is risk management for the college. Students are able to file complaints with the college, with the Human Rights Commission, and with the Office of Civil Rights based on if they feel that they've not been given access. The Office of Civil Rights will generally look to see if the student followed our processes first, and tell them that they should be doing that. And we do have processes for students to file a grievance if they feel that they've been harassed or discriminated against. So the student concerns process is not what they use if they feel like they've had if they've been discriminated against due to disability. I always explain to them that student concerns is about if you don't feel like your teacher taught something correctly, or there was an issue in the class that was not related to your disability. So in order to protect ourselves, the biggest things we need to do is have an interactive process. So that means that we're communicating with students to figure out what they need, that they have to come to us and request something they need. A lot of the cases out there are students saying, well, I didn't get this accommodation, but they never requested it. Or they went to the wrong person and requested it or whatever. So that Office of Civil Rights and the Human Rights Commission look at that. Did the student follow the correct processes? Did we follow our processes? And I've gotten burned with that. I let a student take some makeup tests in our office before she had become an actual client. She provided documentation and things. And then she said that we didn't do things correctly, and it blew up into the grievance situation. And I was like, dang it, if I would have followed our processes and said no, this never would have happened. So I've learned my lesson several times. If we're going to deny an accommodation, we need to show that it fundamentally alters the nature of the program. So that might be, say there's a student, we had a situation where there was a student who wanted to go into occupational therapy assistant program who had a lot of balance issues. And so in occupational therapy, you're walking patients around, you're doing all this stuff with them, and sometimes they don't have good balance. So we spent a lot of time deciding, can the student be accommodated in this program, or are they not otherwise qualified? We got the AG involved. And he actually did start the program and then realized about 2 weeks in, which I knew was gonna happen, that he wasn't gonna be able to do it. Sometimes it's providing the opportunity, and then and that's what we kind of determined, we're like, the student's probably gonna be able to do the academic work, but when it gets to the actual clinical parts of it, and when he has to perform these functions, he's gonna realize this isn't for him, and that's what happened. It might be when we get the students say, well, can I just have this online because I can't come to the classroom. If it's not already offered online, we don't have to provide it in an online format or distance format because that's fundamentally altering how we offer that class. There is a student this winter who asked his instructors if they could come up with an online option for him because he has difficulty with his wheelchair in the snow. And the teachers are willing to look at that. It's an IT program. And so I just let them know that they're not required to do it, but if they want to, that's awesome, and to go for it, and we can help them if they need any technology help. We can deny an accommodation if it's an undue burden. There is sort of like an administrative undue burden, but financial undue burden has never been proven in higher education. When I was at Gonzaga, there was an inaccessible entrance to the cafeteria, and it was a very demeaning way that students had to go up this ramp and then ring a doorbell in the kitchen. The kitchen staff would come open the door and they'd have to go through the kitchen. And so a law student actually complained, and the school said it was an undue burden because it would cost like $1 million or whatever to renovate the building, and it came down that was not, with the reserves and funds that Gonzaga had, it could not be considered an undue burden. We now, with our current financial situation, it might be a little different, but they look at all your resources. So they're going to look at like, okay, you're a state college. What financial needs does the state have? So that probably would never work. So here's some quick don'ts and do's. Don't tell a student you think they have a disability and they need to go to our office. Like I said, you can say like, hey, I noticed you've been struggling with blah, or that this has been hard for you. Here's some resources, and if you want me to connect you with somebody, I'd be happy to do that. Don't ask a student what their disability is if it's not apparent, or call attention to their impairment in public. That was the terrible handwriting situation. Or saying like, oh, you have ADHD, so do I, or whatever. Like, sometimes you feel like you're connecting, but it can actually make somebody feel really uncomfortable. But generally, you're not going to know what their disability is anyway. Sometimes you can figure it out. But we do send a lot of letters about seizure disorders and autism. And those, we don't want to call attention to that if we don't have to. Now, a student with a seizure disorder may ask a teacher, can I tell the class about my seizures in case it happens? And that's okay. Or say they have a tic disorder and they want people to know like why I'm making these vocalizations or moving in a certain way so that it kind of reduces the stigma a little bit. That's okay if they choose to do that. Don't ask for medical records. So this happens pretty regularly. Like a teacher will say, well, if you bring me your medical information, then I can do this or that. It's better not to have that stuff in your hands, because if it gets out somewhere, the student's going to blame you. And so it's better to say, you know what, like, why don't we have the DSS office collect that, and then they can tell me if it's a legitimate thing or not. We get people who, this kid wanted extra time on his math test, and he said he had a rash that was just distracting him so much that he needed extra time on tests, and I denied that accommodation. But a teacher, if they said, well, bring me some information and then I'll approve that, they may not know and they shouldn't be doing extra digging, like I called the doctor, talk to them and stuff like that. So it's great to have us take that information and not let the student give it to you, especially if it's like psychiatric stuff or something like that could get out there, or they could perceive that somehow got out there and somebody is now discriminating against them. Now, if it's like I sprained my ankle and here's when I went to the doctor, that's a little different, but kind of that more serious stuff, I wouldn't take it. Do include a syllabus statement about disability, and I meant to hyperlink that, and I was gonna email it to you guys if I can do that. There are syllabus statements in our faculty and staff area of the intranet. Do allow students to succeed or fail on their own merit. If we provide equal access, we've given them opportunity, and then it's up to them. And students fail all the time, with disabilities and with accommodations, and it's their right to attempt to go to school and fail just like anyone else, and that's really hard sometimes, because we want everybody to be successful, but they're human beings who succeed and fail just like everyone else. That can be a hard one. And then, do you consult with us anytime you're concerned about a student with a disability, accommodation is unclear, or you do not think the accommodation is appropriate in your class? We put accommodations in place that kind of blanket, like, okay, this should help with this, but really, it may not be appropriate in your class, or we might need to do something different because they are just general. We're looking at the student in general. So we don't know everything. We might send you something by mistake that's not appropriate, and we definitely should have that dialogue if something's not working or something's not right. If a student is misbehaving and you're like, sometimes teachers will give people more leeway because of a disability, but if you're like, this doesn't seem right, feel free to consult anytime. Yesterday I told somebody, just put in a bit and call security because this is not okay, what was happening. And we're there to listen and to help, but sometimes we don't even know what to do. So we don't have a lot of people, and it's about time. But if we had a lot of faculty here who kind of worked with students a long time, I wanted to know, when they had a student with accommodation, like what did they need from us that they didn't get? What information would have been helpful? And what could maybe the student have done better to advocate for themselves? So you're a librarian, but you probably see students. So I don't know, if you guys have any things that you'd like to talk about?
I do have a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times I'll have classes come to our library classroom. A couple weeks ago, I did have a teacher say like, oh, I have a student who has to have an extra chair, like a specific setup. I forgot to tell her we were coming to the library, so she's not here today. And I was like, oh, I don't know, is there something that usually part of that dialogue when I set something up with faculty is talking about their lesson and what I can do. Is there anything you recommend I say just to acknowledge as because I know that she just forgot.
Yeah.
But is there anything you would recommend that I mention in setting up that?
So you could say, are there any students who have accommodations in your class I need to be aware of? Because it might be say somebody has a visual impairment and you're like, oh, okay, I need to read everything that I'm putting up here. Or maybe they can't hear so well and you need to speak up a little more. Or they're bringing an interpreter and you're like, oh, what's that here? There was a student who, her teacher told me they were going to the library, and the library, she needed to elevate her leg. We put a stool in there for her.
I think they came multiple times, so I think the first time was the leg.
I was like, we did that.
No, yeah. I think, yeah.
Okay, good.
After she's like, I'll make sure to do that next time. But it just got me thinking maybe that's something I should check in about because
That's a good idea.
if we're out of context, right?
Yeah. What else? Or if there's a certain student who, just is there any quirks or anything you need to know about? Because what if there's a student who stutters and you call on them and then they're just sitting there not responding and you don't know that, so then you're like, okay. But if the teacher let you know that, then you could be patient or not call on them or whatever it might be. So that's a great idea, just to say, is there any accommodations or students that I need to know about to do something differently for them?
Just as a best practice.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Anything you guys have noticed with students or any questions?
I think historically, if I got a notice that a student had a need through DSS, it was never a problem. It was usually something very easy, like they needed a desk in the front of the class or they needed a computer for their notes. And I'd get that letter and I'd talk to that student, it'd be fine. It was always the students that probably should have been using DSS resources and words.
Yeah.
And where you might notify them that this would be helpful to them, and there would usually be a denial or a resistance
Yeah.
about going in.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if you can talk to them during your office hours or find ways to frame it like around like, I see you're struggling with this. I had one English teacher a couple of quarters ago send 3 students, and all 3 of them said, this teacher right in front of the class said to me, I think you have a learning disability and you need to go to DSS. The crazy thing is she was right about every single one. 2 of them I think knew it and they just hadn't done anything. They were in kind of denial. And then one, we talked and there was definitely like a history. And so we talked about some options for maybe getting diagnosed or whatever. But at least one of them was like really, really angry and kind of embarrassed and stuff. And so it's like finding a way when you can talk to them in private, like I can see you're struggling here or whatever it might be, is so important because sometimes they don't know or they're still in denial a little bit and they need to hear it from you. And you guys, I think in English see it a lot because of writing. It really comes out in the writing. Yeah.
That example you used where the words were moving on a page, what is that condition?
Some, there's one thing called Erlin syndrome, which has been sort of disputed whether it's a true thing or not, kind of quack science. But what they think, there's like convergence issues where the eyes aren't working together at times, so they're not tracking together. Also, it can just be a neurological issue. And I guess, and I don't know the science behind this, but I guess white and black is just a really bad combination it's too contrasty. And so it just neurologically, some people just can't, it just doesn't work well for them. So most of the students who have that moving thing, a blue color, somehow, if you ever have a chance, put a blue like a folder cover or something, like a clear blue over a page, and you'll notice like it just calms it down. And it's just interesting. I have all the color. My predecessor was really into that. I don't quite buy Erlin syndrome, but he had all the Erlin overlays in the office, and so I have like every color. And so there's red and yellow and blue and green, but blue is typically the one that people are like, oh, that looks so good. And it works for a while. Like some people will get tinted glasses from these doctors who do Erlin syndrome stuff, but over time it loses its efficacy. And it really does not fix an underlying problem. Like generally it's a learning disability of some kind. I've never seen anyone who's cured by wearing colored glasses or prisms in their glasses. It just helps someone. So the overlays are better than colored glasses because you can only use it when you need it. It's very weird.
Is it recommended to still use black and white, like with black writing, or has that changed?
I think it's still normal, and it's better contrast for the majority of people. So either black with light or white with black. Some people with vision impairments really like black with yellow. That drives me nuts, but yeah. Anything else? All right. Was this helpful?
Yeah.
Awesome.
I also wanted to say when you came and did the demonstration for the librarians that we've all been implementing the changes that
Really?
you came and did. Like we're being very conscious of like headers and like alt words and stuff. So thank you.
Oh, that is so
Yeah.
cool. I'm really glad to hear that. I'm so glad. Yeah, sometimes it just seems so simple. I feel like, oh, I'm boring these people to death, but it's good information. Yeah. And he's going to be our expert on that.
Yeah, that's what I'm working on right now. Headers. Everybody use headers, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's now whenever I create a document for anything, even like this, I put in alt text for the images. I did not check my reading order, but I didn't alter it very much, so it should be fine. But yeah, because you never know who you're going to email it to or who's going to read it. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you.